The January wind carried no mercy as it swept through the market square of Thornfield, bringing with it the whispers that had haunted Miss Eleanor Blackwood for weeks. Even the sparse dusting of snow could not muffle the voices that followed her slender figure, wrapped inadequately in what remained of her once fine coat. There she is, the Blackwood girl. Her father's debts have left her with naught but her name, and even that shall soon belong to another, I hear. Eleanor fixed her gaze upon the modest bouquet of winter violets she had come to purchase, the last luxury she would allow herself before tomorrow's ceremony. With trembling fingers, she extended her last shilling toward the flower seller, a woman who had once curtsied to her father. "Sell your flowers elsewhere, girl. Our market keeps no pity for the daughters of thieves," the woman hissed, turning away. The coins fell from Eleanor's hand, tinkling against the cobblestones with a finality that seemed to echo her fate. She knelt to retrieve them, dignity fracturing with each passing moment as the crowd gathered to witness her humiliation. The hem of her dress, once the color of summer sky, now faded to the pallor of December clouds, dragged through the slush. "If the lady wishes for violets, then violets she shall have." The voice cut through the market's cruel murmurs, like a blade through silk. Eleanor did not need to look up to know its owner. The rich baritone belonged to the very architect of her family's downfall, His Grace, the Duke of Ravenswood, Lord Edward Blackthorne. "I believe, madam," he continued, addressing the flower seller with glacial courtesy, "that your business thrives upon commerce, not judgment. The lady's coin is as good as any other's." The market fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "Your Grace," the flower seller stammered, curtsying so low that her knees nearly touched the frozen ground. "I meant—" "No, you meant precisely what you said," he interrupted, his tone measured but holding the weight of steel. "And yet I find myself in a forgiving mood. The bouquet, if you please." The flower seller hastily gathered the finest violets, wrapping them in paper with trembling fingers. The Duke placed a gold sovereign in her palm, a sum worth 20 times the humble flower's value, and received the bouquet with gloved hands. Eleanor remained kneeling, her pride preventing her from accepting this gesture from the man who had called in her father's debts, forcing him to take his own life and leaving her with the choice between marriage to his creditor or destitution. "Miss Blackwood," he said, his voice lowered so that only she might hear, "while I understand your reluctance to accept anything from my hand, I would remind you that tomorrow you become my Duchess. The world will be watching, and I would not have my wife kneeling in the dirt." He extended a gloved hand, and Eleanor was acutely aware of every eye upon them. To refuse him here would be to invite further scandal upon a name already dragged through the mud of public opinion. With a composure born of years of gentle breeding, she placed her fingers upon his, and allowed him to assist her to her feet. "I take no pleasure in your circumstances, Miss Blackwood," he said, pressing the violets into her hand, "nor do I expect your forgiveness, but I do expect your dignity to remain intact." Before she could respond, a carriage drew up beside them, his carriage, with its gleaming black lacquer and the Ravenswood crest emblazoned on the door. "Allow me to escort you home," he said, though they both knew it was not a request. As he handed her into the carriage, Eleanor caught a glimpse of something unexpected in his eyes, not the cold triumph she had anticipated, but something akin to regret. It disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving her to wonder if it had been merely a trick of the winter light. The carriage door closed with a sound like fate sealing, and as they pulled away from the market square, Eleanor clutched the violets with white-knuckled fingers. Tomorrow she would become the Duchess of Ravenswood, wife to the man who had destroyed her family. She had expected to feel nothing but hatred as the hour approached, yet now in the confines of his carriage, breathing in the scent of leather and sandalwood that surrounded him, she found her certainty wavering. The note that had arrived with her wedding gown that morning now burned in her pocket. "Your father's debts are paid. Your mother's future is secured. All that remains is for you to fulfill your part in our arrangement." The carriage wheels cut through the snow, carrying her toward Thornfield Manor, her childhood home soon to be left behind. Eleanor watched the familiar landscape pass by, wondering how long until the hatred in her heart might thaw, if ever. Beside her the Duke remained silent, his profile sharp against the window's grey light. He reached for a sealed document in his coat, breaking the wax with a decisive snap. The Thornfield Manor Library, once the pride of Eleanor's father, now stood mostly barren, its shelves as hollow as her promises for the future. What few volumes remained were those too worthless for the creditors to seize, poetry collections and worn novels that had been her mother's sole companions since taking to her sickbed following her husband's death. Eleanor stood at the window, watching as the Duke's carriage disappeared down the tree-lined drive. He had left her at the door with nothing but a curt bow and a reminder. "My solicitor will arrive at 9 to escort you to the chapel." Be ready." A quiet footfall behind her announced the arrival of Mrs. Porter, the housekeeper who had stayed despite months of missed wages. "A cup of tea, Miss Eleanor?" she offered, holding a tray that bore the last intact pieces of the Blackwood china, a teapot, and 2 cups with faded blue flowers winding around their rims. "How very English of us," Eleanor replied, her voice brittle with forced lightness. "Taking tea while the wolves are at the door." Mrs. Porter's weathered face remained stoic as she set the tray upon the small table that had escaped the auctioneer's gavel. "Wolves or dukes, miss, the English take their tea regardless." This small jest, the first either had ventured in weeks, brought a ghost of a smile to Eleanor's lips as she accepted the cup. The warmth seeped into her fingers, still chilled from the Market Square encounter. "He was there today," she said after a long silence, "at the market. He intervened when the flower seller refused my custom." Mrs. Porter's eyebrows rose slightly. "His Grace himself, not one of his men." "Indeed." Eleanor traced the rim of her cup with one finger. "He purchased violets for me after I was refused them." "Perhaps," the housekeeper ventured carefully. "His character is not as black as circumstances have painted it." Eleanor set down her cup with more force than necessary, the china rattling against its saucer. "He systematically purchased my father's debts from every creditor in London, Mrs. Porter. He consolidated them for the express purpose of demanding immediate payment, knowing full well it would ruin us. My father's—" her voice faltered. "My father's despair was of his making, and yet he has offered marriage rather than debtor's prison," Mrs. Porter observed, her tone neutral. "A cage is still a cage, however gilded its bars." The grandfather clock in the hall, the last significant piece of furniture remaining, chimed the hour with a sonorous dignity that belied the house's fallen state. "I should look in on Mother," Eleanor said, rising from her chair. She climbed the stairs to the east wing, where Lady Blackwood had sequestered herself since the day they had cut her husband's body down from the library rafters. The door to her mother's chamber stood ajar, and Eleanor paused at the threshold, watching as her mother slept fitfully beneath the coverlet. A folded paper lay on the bedside table, another letter from the Duke. Eleanor slipped into the room and took it up, breaking the familiar wax seal. "Lady Blackwood," it read in a firm, decisive hand. "I write to inform you that arrangements have been made for your continued residence at Rose Cottage on the southern edge of the Ravenswood estate following your daughter's marriage. A stipend has been allocated for your comfort and care. You may bring Mrs. Porter should you wish it. Regards, Ravenswood." Eleanor refolded the letter, her hands trembling with emotions she could not name. Hatred, certainly, but mingled now with confusion. This provision for her mother had not been part of their arrangement. It was an unexpected kindness from a man she had deemed incapable of the sentiment. "Is that from him?" Her mother's voice, thin as parchment, startled her from her reverie. "Yes," Eleanor admitted, returning to her mother's bedside and taking her frail hand. "He has arranged for your residence at Rose Cottage. You'll have fresh air and gardens come spring." Lady Blackwood's eyes, once bright with vitality, now clouded with grief, searched her daughter's face. "And you, my darling girl, what has he arranged for you?" Eleanor summoned a smile that did not reach her eyes. A title, security. What more could a woman ask for in this world? "Perhaps love," her mother suggested, squeezing her hand with what little strength remained to her. "Love is a luxury we can no longer afford, Mother," Eleanor replied, tucking the coverlet more securely around the older woman's shoulders. As twilight descended, casting long shadows through the bedchamber window, a noise from below drew Eleanor's attention. The sound of carriage wheels on gravel, followed by the heavy knocker at the front door. She descended to find Mrs. Porter admitting a tall, austere man in the livery of the Duke's household, bearing a large box. "Miss Blackwood," the man said with a formal bow, "His Grace has sent this for your inspection before tomorrow's ceremony." The box was placed in her hands, surprisingly heavy, bound with satin ribbon. Eleanor carried it to the library, setting it upon the table where she had taken tea earlier. With hesitant fingers, she untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. Within lay a book, leather-bound, its gilded edges gleaming in the lamplight. A note rested atop it. "This belonged to your father. I thought it fitting that it should return to his daughter." Eleanor lifted the volume with reverent hands. It was her father's prized first edition of Milton's Paradise Lost, sold months ago to offset a fraction of his debts. She opened it to find the bookplate bearing the Blackwood crest still intact. A sound escaped her lips, half sob, half laugh of disbelief. That the Duke would return this treasured piece of her father's legacy on the eve of their wedding seemed a gesture too thoughtful for the villain she had constructed in her mind. She traced the embossed title with her fingertip, wondering what game the Duke of Ravenswood was playing. Was this a peace offering, a bribe to soften her hatred, or something more calculated that she had yet to discern? The clock struck 9, marking 12 hours until her wedding. 12 hours until she would bind herself to a man she had sworn to despise until her dying breath. Eleanor closed the book and held it to her chest, feeling the familiar weight against her heart. In the quiet of the library, with only the crackling fire as witness, she allowed herself to whisper the question that had begun to haunt her. Who are you truly, Edward Blackthorne? The wind rattled the windows, carrying with it the first heavy flakes of a winter storm. Tomorrow she would become the Duchess of Ravenswood. Tomorrow she would leave behind everything she had known. The letter from the Duke, still in her pocket, seemed to pulse against her side like a second heartbeat. A sharp knock came at the door. The small stone chapel of St. Agnes stood resolute against the snowfall, its grey spire piercing the white sky like an accusation. Inside, candles flickered in iron sconces, casting uncertain light upon the ancient pews, where not a soul sat to witness this union. Only the solicitor, Mr. Winters, and the aged vicar waited at the altar with the Duke. Eleanor entered alone, her steps measured upon the worn stone floor. She had chosen to wear her mother's wedding gown, altered hastily by Mrs. Porter's capable hands. The ivory silk, though somewhat yellowed with age, still held a quiet elegance, its high collar and fitted sleeves giving her the appearance of a marble statue, beautiful but cold. The Duke turned at the sound of her approach. In the candlelight, his features seemed less severe than she remembered from their market encounter. His eyes, the colour of storm clouds, widened slightly at the sight of her. "Miss Blackwood," he said, his voice echoing in the empty chapel. "I had thought perhaps you might not come." "I am a woman of my word, Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "Unlike some, I honour my commitments." Something like pain flickered across his face before his expression settled into its customary reserve. "Then let us proceed." The ceremony was brief, the ancient words binding them together spoken with mechanical precision by the vicar. When asked for the ring, the Duke produced a band of gold set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "It was my mother's," he explained, as he slid it onto her finger. His hand, surprisingly warm against her cold one, lingered a moment longer than necessary. Eleanor stared at the ring, its weight unfamiliar. Not the ostentatious ruby she had expected, a symbol of ownership, but something delicate and tinged with sentiment. "With this ring I thee wed," he recited, his voice lower than before, meant for her ears alone. "And with all my worldly goods, I thee endow." The irony of these words was not lost on Eleanor. His worldly goods now included her family home, her father's possessions, and her very self, all acquired through calculated financial maneuvering. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, the Duke did not kiss her, as was his right. Instead, he offered his arm, which she took with outward composure while inwardly trembling with emotions she could not name. "The carriage awaits, Duchess," he said, the title falling from his lips like a foreign word he was testing for the first time. Outside, the snow had thickened, blanketing the churchyard in pristine white. The Duke's carriage stood ready, his crest freshly painted upon the door. Beneath it, she now noted with surprise, the Blackwood crest had been added, smaller but intact. "A concession to your heritage," he explained, following her gaze. "Your family name deserves to be remembered with dignity." This unexpected acknowledgement left Eleanor momentarily speechless as he handed her into the carriage. She settled onto the velvet seat, arranging her skirts with hands that no longer seemed to belong to her. The journey to Ravenswood Hall passed in silence. Eleanor watched the countryside transform under winter's touch, familiar landmarks disappearing beneath the snow until she felt utterly lost, a fitting metaphor for her current state. The Duke sat opposite her, his attention seemingly fixed on a leather-bound portfolio he had extracted from his coat. Yet she caught him watching her reflection in the carriage window, his expression unreadable. "You are not what I expected, Your Grace," she finally said, the words escaping before she could reconsider them. He looked up, one dark eyebrow raised in inquiry. "And what did you expect, Duchess?" "More cruelty," she answered honestly. "Less consideration." He closed his portfolio, regarding her directly now. "You believe me capable only of malice?" "I believe you capable of anything that serves your purposes," she countered, "including momentary kindness, when it suits you." A mirthless smile touched his lips. "How well you have taken my measure, and yet not entirely." He tapped the portfolio with one gloved finger. "There are matters concerning your father's estate that require discussion, but that can wait until you are settled." Eleanor's spine stiffened. "I would prefer to know now what further designs you have upon my family's remains." Something like respect, flickered in his eyes at her direct challenge. He handed her the portfolio without further comment. Within were documents, legal papers written in the dense language of solicitors. Eleanor scanned them, her literary education sufficient to grasp their meaning, though some terms eluded her. "This appears to be a transfer of ownership," she said, looking up with confusion. "Indeed." His gaze held hers steadily. "Thornfield Manor and its remaining lands are being placed in trust for your mother's lifetime use, and thereafter." He paused. "Thereafter, they pass to any children that may result from our union." Eleanor's hand trembled, causing the papers to rustle. "But you own Thornfield. You purchased the debt and claimed it when my father could not pay." "I did," he acknowledged. "And now I am disposing of it as I see fit." "Why?" The question hung between them, as tangible as the snowflakes swirling outside the carriage windows. The Duke looked away, his profile sharp against the winter landscape. "Perhaps I am not the villain you have cast me as in your narrative, Duchess." Before she could respond, the carriage passed through massive iron gates and turned onto a long drive flanked by ancient oaks. Ravenswood Hall loomed ahead, a grand manor house of grey stone and countless windows, smoke curling from a dozen chimneys against the leaden sky. "Welcome to your new home," the Duke said, his tone neutral. Eleanor gazed up at the imposing structure, trying to imagine herself as mistress of such a place. The carriage came to a halt before wide stone steps, where a line of servants stood waiting to greet their new Duchess, despite the falling snow. The Duke descended first, then offered his hand to assist her. As Eleanor placed her fingers upon his palm, their eyes met. In that moment, standing between her past and her future, she glimpsed something unexpected in his gaze. A vulnerability at odds with the powerful man who had systematically dismantled her family's fortune. "I will never love you," she whispered, low enough that only he could hear. "I have not asked for your love," he replied, his voice equally soft, "merely your presence." As they ascended the steps together, Eleanor was keenly aware of her hand resting upon his arm, the physical connection between them a stark reminder of the legal bonds now joining their lives. The great oak doors of Ravenswood Hall swung open, revealing a grand entrance hall warmed by massive hearths. The housekeeper stepped forward, a stately woman with silver-threaded dark hair. "Your Grace," she curtsied to the Duke, then turned to Eleanor. "Your Grace," she repeated with equal deference. "Mrs. Winters, may I present the Duchess of Ravenswood?" the Duke said formally. "She is to be afforded every courtesy, and her wishes are to be respected as my own." "Of course, Your Grace," Mrs. Winters replied, then addressed Eleanor directly. "We have prepared the Duchess suite in the East Wing. If you would follow me, I shall show you to your chambers." Eleanor glanced at the Duke, uncertain of the protocol in this strange new world. "Go," he said quietly. "Rest. Dine in your rooms if you wish. Tomorrow is soon enough to begin your duties as mistress here." She nodded, following Mrs. Winters toward a grand staircase. As she ascended, Eleanor felt the Duke's gaze upon her back, a physical weight she could not decipher as hostility or something else entirely. At the top of the stairs she paused and turned. He remained in the entrance hall, his tall figure stark against the marble floor, watching her with an intensity that sent an unexpected shiver along her spine. "Until tomorrow, Duchess," he called up to her, his deep voice carrying in the vaulted space. "Until tomorrow, Your Grace," she responded automatically. As Mrs. Winters led her through corridors hung with ancestral portraits and tapestries, Eleanor tried to make sense of the man she had married. The cruel creditor who had driven her father to despair, the considerate husband who had restored her mother's home, the enigmatic Duke whose true motives remained opaque. The housekeeper opened a set of double doors, revealing chambers of unexpected beauty, walls papered in pale blue silk, furnishings of polished rosewood, a four-poster bed draped in velvet, the color of midnight. These were prepared according to His Grace's specific instructions, Mrs. Winters explained, moving to stir the fire in the marble hearth. "He had the rooms redecorated this past month." Eleanor touched the spine of a book on a small table, one of many filling the shelves that lined one wall. She opened it to find her own bookplate inside. With growing wonder she examined the others. They were her books, those she had been forced to sell. "He sent men to track down your library," Mrs. Winters said, noting her surprise. "It took some doing, I'm told. Not all could be recovered." Eleanor sank into a chair, overwhelmed by this revelation. "I don't understand," she whispered, more to herself than to the housekeeper. Mrs. Winters' expression softened slightly. "His Grace is a complex man, Your Grace. Perhaps in time you will come to know him better than you do now." Left alone in her new chambers, Eleanor moved to the window, watching snowflakes swirl against the darkening sky. In the reflection of the glass, she saw not only herself but the ghost of the girl she had been just that morning, filled with righteous anger and the certainty of her husband's villainy. Now, as the first day of her marriage drew to a close, that certainty had begun to fracture, like ice in the first tentative thaw of spring. A soft knock at the door drew her from her reverie. A maid entered, carrying a silver tray with a sealed letter bearing the Duke's crest. Eleanor broke the seal on the Duke's letter with trembling fingers. The parchment was heavy, bearing the Ravenswood watermark, and his script flowed across it with confident precision. "My dear Duchess," it read, "I trust you find your chambers satisfactory. I would be honored if you would join me for breakfast in the morning library at 9. There are matters concerning your father's affairs that require your attention. Until then, consider Ravenswood Hall your home in truth, not merely in name. You may go where you wish and inquire about anything that interests you. Nothing is forbidden to you here. Ravenswood." She traced her fingertip over his signature, noting that he had not signed as your husband, or even with his Christian name. The formality maintained a distance between them that she found both comforting and strangely disappointing. Sleep eluded Eleanor that night, despite the luxurious feather bed. She rose before dawn, watching from her window as the snow-covered grounds of Ravenswood emerged from darkness. The estate stretched before her, formal gardens now blanketed in white, a frozen lake glimmering in the distance, and beyond, the shadowy line of ancient woods. When her lady's maid, a quiet girl named Sarah, arrived with hot chocolate and toast, Eleanor was already dressed in the simplest of her new gowns, a deep blue merino wool that complemented her pale complexion. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace," Sarah said hesitantly, "but Mrs. Winters suggested the green silk for your first morning as Duchess." "Did she indeed?" Eleanor replied, smoothing her skirts. "Well, Sarah, you may inform Mrs. Winters that while I appreciate her counsel, I shall dress according to my own preferences." This small act of defiance bolstered her courage as she navigated the labyrinthine corridors of Ravenswood Hall. Servants paused in their duties to bow or curtsy as she passed, their curious gazes following her when they thought she wouldn't notice. The morning library proved easier to find than anticipated. A circular room in the west wing, its walls lined with books from floor to ceiling, interrupted only by tall windows that admitted the pale winter sunlight. A fire blazed in the hearth, beside which was set an intimate breakfast table for two. The Duke stood at one of the windows, his back to the door. He had forgone his formal coat in favor of a well-tailored waistcoat over a white shirt, giving him a more approachable appearance than the forbidding figure from the chapel. "Good morning, Your Grace," Eleanor said, announcing her presence. He turned, and for a fleeting moment she glimpsed surprise in his eyes. Whether at her punctuality or her appearance, she could not tell. "Duchess," he acknowledged with a slight bow, "I trust you slept well?" "Well enough for one whose life has been so thoroughly transformed in the span of a day," she replied honestly. A hint of a smile touched his lips as he pulled out her chair. "Directness becomes you, though it is not a quality much admired in society." "Then it is fortunate that we find ourselves without an audience," she remarked, taking her seat. The breakfast that followed was a curiously domestic affair. The Duke poured tea from a silver pot, inquired about her preferences for toast and preserves, and maintained a flow of conversation about the estate that required little from her beyond attentive listening. "You mentioned my father's affairs," Eleanor finally said, setting down her cup. "What matters require my attention?" The Duke's expression grew serious. He rose and retrieved a leather folio from his desk, placing it before her. "These are the complete records of your father's transactions over the past 5 years. I believe you will find them illuminating." With mounting trepidation, Eleanor opened the folio. Pages of accounts, correspondence, and legal documents lay within. She scanned them with growing confusion until a pattern began to emerge, a pattern that contradicted everything she had believed about her father's downfall. "This indicates that my father was systematically defrauded," she said slowly, looking up at the Duke, "by his own solicitor, Mr. Carmichael." "Yes," the Duke confirmed, his grey eyes holding hers. "Carmichael diverted funds, forged your father's signature on loans, and then disappeared to the continent 3 months ago." "But you," Eleanor faltered, her certainty wavering, "you purchased my father's debts. You demanded payment." "I purchased the debts when I discovered the fraud," he corrected her gently. "I had been investigating Carmichael for similar schemes against other gentlemen. Your father, unfortunately, was already too deep in despair to listen when I attempted to explain." Eleanor's hands clenched in her lap, her mind struggling to reconcile this new information with the narrative she had constructed. "Why did you not tell me this before? Would you have believed me?" he asked simply. "Or would you have seen it as a cruel manipulation, another reason to despise me?" Before she could respond, the library door burst open to admit a woman of striking beauty. Her golden hair was arranged in an elaborate style, her crimson gown cut in the latest London fashion, and her expression one of calculated surprise. "Edward, darling, I've only just heard the extraordinary news of your marriage," she exclaimed, her voice musical, yet somehow false, her blue eyes fixed on Eleanor with barely disguised assessment. "And this must be your bride." The Duke had risen at this interruption, his posture rigid. "Lady Harrington," he said coolly, "you arrive uninvited as usual." "Surely the Dowager Duchess's goddaughter requires no invitation," she replied with a tinkling laugh. "Besides, I simply had to meet the mysterious woman who has captured the elusive Duke of Ravenswood." She extended a gloved hand to Eleanor. "Cecilia Harrington, my dear, such a pleasure to meet you." Eleanor rose and acknowledged the introduction with as much grace as she could muster. "Lady Harrington, I must say," Cecilia continued, removing her gloves with deliberate slowness, "the entire county is abuzz with this sudden match. A secret romance, perhaps, or something more pragmatic." Her smile did not reach her eyes. "Though I cannot imagine what the daughter of a disgraced gentleman could offer a duke." Eleanor felt the blood rush to her face at this thinly veiled insult, but before she could respond, the Duke stepped between them. "My marriage is neither sudden nor mysterious to those who matter, Lady Harrington," he said, his tone arctic, "and my choice of bride is not subject to the county's approval, nor yours." Cecilia's composure faltered momentarily before she recovered with another brittle laugh. "How ferociously protective you've become, Edward. I merely thought to welcome the new Duchess and perhaps offer my guidance in navigating her new position. Society can be so unforgiving to those without proper connections." "The Duchess of Ravenswood requires no guidance from you," the Duke replied. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have private matters to discuss." Cecilia's lovely face hardened, her gaze darting between them. "Of course. Far be it from me to intrude upon newlyweds." She turned to Eleanor with a venomous smile. "Do call upon me at Harrington Lodge, Duchess. I have such fascinating stories to share about your husband's past." With a rustle of silk, she swept from the room, leaving a lingering scent of too sweet perfume. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I take it Lady Harrington is more than merely your mother's goddaughter." The Duke returned to his seat with a weary sigh. "Cecilia expected to become Duchess of Ravenswood. It was an arrangement favored by my mother before her passing, and yet you chose to marry a ruined gentleman's daughter instead," Eleanor observed. "I begin to understand Lady Harrington's displeasure." Something like amusement flickered in the Duke's eyes. "Do you indeed?" Eleanor's mind whirled with new questions. If he had not ruined her father, if he had in fact been trying to help, why had he insisted on their marriage? What purpose did it serve? She glanced down at the document still spread before her, then back at the Duke's inscrutable face. "Your Grace," she began carefully, "if these records are accurate—" "They are," he interjected. "Then I have misjudged you terribly," she finished. "But that still doesn't explain why you would bind yourself to a woman who despised you." The Duke rose and moved to the window, his back to her once more. "Perhaps that is a conversation for another time." A knock at the door heralded the arrival of Mr. Winters, the Duke's solicitor. "Your Grace, the magistrate has arrived regarding the matter we discussed." The Duke nodded. "Show him to my study." He turned back to Eleanor. "I must attend to this. Please, continue reviewing the documents. We shall speak again at dinner." As he reached the door, Eleanor called after him, "Your Grace." He paused, looking back at her. "Thank you," she said simply, "for returning my books." Something softened in his expression. It seemed a small thing, to preserve what could be saved of your past. With a slight bow he departed, leaving her alone with the evidence of her father's betrayal and her husband's innocence. Eleanor sat in the quiet library, the weight of revelation pressing upon her. Everything she had believed about the Duke, about her father's death, about her own circumstances, had been built upon a foundation of falsehood. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts, and with a truth that threatened to rewrite the story she had told herself about the man she had married. February arrived with bitter winds that howled around Ravenswood's stone battlements like restless spirits. A fortnight had passed since Eleanor's wedding day, each hour both expanding her understanding of her new home and deepening the mystery of her husband. They had settled into a curious routine, breakfast taken together in the morning library, dinner in the formal dining room, and the hours between filled with the separate duties of their positions. The Duke attended to estate matters, disappearing on horseback to visit tenants or closeting himself with stewards and solicitors. Eleanor, meanwhile, had begun the formidable task of acquainting herself with Ravenswood Hall and its household. Mrs. Winters had proven an unexpected ally, her initial formality melting into cautious warmth as Eleanor demonstrated genuine interest in the household's workings. Together they had reviewed menus, inspected linen cupboards, and discussed the rotation of seasonal staff. "His Grace seems pleased with your management," Mrs. Winters remarked that morning as they examined the week's household accounts in the morning room. "He mentioned your suggestions for improving the servants' quarters." Eleanor looked up from the ledger in surprise. "Did he? He said nothing to me." The housekeeper smiled faintly. "His Grace is not one for unnecessary words, but he has directed Mr. Phillips to implement your changes immediately. That speaks more plainly than any praise." A curious warmth blossomed in Eleanor's chest at this information. She had spoken to the Duke of the cramped, poorly ventilated servants' quarters only once. During a dinner conversation she had thought largely one-sided. "Mrs. Winters," Eleanor began hesitantly, "may I ask you something of a personal nature?" The housekeeper inclined her head in permission. "How long have you served the Duke?" "I came to Ravenswood when His Grace was but 10 years old," Mrs. Winters replied. "After the previous Duke, his father, passed." "Then you have known him since childhood," Eleanor observed. "Was he always so—" She searched for the right word. "Reserved." A shadow passed over Mrs. Winters' face. The late Duke of Ravenswood was not a gentle father. His Grace learned early to guard his thoughts and feelings. She hesitated, then added softly, "The boy who came to Ravenswood at 10 was already a man in many ways. I have seen him smile perhaps a dozen times in 20 years. This glimpse into her husband's past troubled Eleanor as she continued her daily inspection of the house. She found herself in the portrait gallery, a long chamber where generations of blackthorns gazed from gilded frames with the same storm-grey eyes her husband possessed. She paused before the largest portrait, the late Duke, a forbidding figure with a cruel twist to his mouth, his hand resting possessively on the shoulder of a dark-haired boy who stood rigid beside him. The child's face, though composed, held a wariness that struck Eleanor to her core. "An excellent likeness, though I was somewhat younger than I appear there," came her husband's voice from behind her. "Painters are instructed to flatter their subjects, but Harrington insisted on capturing the truth. It cost him future commissions from my father." Eleanor turned, startled by his unexpected presence. The Duke stood a few paces away, still in his riding clothes, his hair windswept and cheeks reddened from the cold. "Your father seems—" she began. "Tyrannical," he supplied with a wry twist of his lips. "He was, particularly to those who could not escape his influence." "Like his son," Eleanor said softly. The Duke's gaze remained on the portrait. "And his wife. My mother fled into illness to escape him, a familiar pattern among the women of Ravenswood." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I hope you will break that tradition, Duchess." Before she could respond, a footman appeared at the gallery entrance. "Your Grace, Lady Harrington has arrived. She awaits you in the blue salon." A flicker of annoyance crossed the Duke's face. "Inform Lady Harrington that the Duchess and I will receive her shortly." When the footman had gone, he turned to Eleanor. "I apologize for Cecilia's persistence. If you prefer not to receive her, I can make your excuses." Eleanor straightened her shoulders. "I am Duchess of Ravenswood now. I will not hide in my own home." Something like pride gleamed in his eyes. "No, I don't imagine you would." He offered his arm, which she took with only a moment's hesitation. "Shall we face the lioness together, then?" They found Cecilia arranging herself artfully on a settee, her emerald gown a striking contrast to the room's pale blue furnishings. She rose with practiced grace at their entrance. "Edward, your Grace," she amended, curtsying to Eleanor with perfect form if not perfect sincerity. "I've brought news from London that I simply had to deliver personally." The Duke indicated that she should resume her seat, while he and Eleanor occupied chairs opposite. "What news warrants such an immediate visit, Lady Harrington?" Cecilia's smile turned cat-like. "Why, the latest on date concerns your own bride." She turned to Eleanor with false sympathy. "I'm afraid, my dear, that your father's disgrace continues to be fodder for gossip. The Morning Post carried a most vicious account of his final act." Eleanor's hands clenched in her lap, but she kept her expression composed. "The papers are ever hungry for scandal, Lady Harrington, even stale ones." "Indeed," Cecilia continued undeterred, "but this article suggested new details, that your father confessed to embezzlement before taking his life. Most shocking." The Duke's voice cut through the salon like steel. "That is quite enough, Cecilia." "I merely thought the Duchess should be prepared," Cecilia protested innocently. After all, she must make her London debut this spring. "Society will be curious about the new Duchess of Ravenswood." Eleanor felt rather than saw her husband's tension. "My wife's reception in society is of no concern," he stated flatly. "Her position is unassailable by virtue of our marriage." "Of course," Cecilia agreed smoothly, though I wonder if she knows the true circumstances of that hasty ceremony. Her blue eyes glittered with malice. Does she know about the wager, Edward? The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Eleanor turned to the Duke, whose face had gone rigid. What wager? She asked quietly. Cecilia, the Duke warned, his voice dangerously soft. Oh dear, Cecilia exclaimed with mock dismay. Have I spoken out of turn? I simply assumed, given your closeness, that you would have shared everything with your bride. Eleanor rose from her chair, her heart pounding. Lady Harrington, while your concern for my welfare is touching, I find I must attend to household matters. Perhaps you might call again when your schedule permits a longer visit. Cecilia's smile faltered at this polite dismissal. Of course, Your Grace, though we really must speak privately soon, woman to woman. After Cecilia had been escorted out, Eleanor remained in the blue salon, standing by the window as she watched the woman's carriage disappear down the drive. She spoke of a wager, Eleanor said without turning, as she sensed her husband's presence behind her. Cecilia delights in creating discord, the Duke replied, his voice carefully neutral. It would be unwise to credit anything she says. Eleanor faced him then, searching his inscrutable features. Is there truth in her accusation? Something like resignation passed over his face. There was a wager, he admitted, not of my making, but I allowed it to stand. What were its terms? Eleanor asked, her voice steady, despite the trembling that had begun deep within her. The Duke moved to the fireplace, staring into the flames as if seeking words there. Lord Pembroke wagered that no respectable woman would marry me, given my reputation. The sum was considerable, enough to restore several tenants' farms after last year's floods. And so you wed me to win a bet, Eleanor concluded, the pieces falling into terrible alignment. A ruined gentleman's daughter, desperate enough to accept any offer. No, he said sharply, turning to face her. That is not why I married you. Then why? The question that had haunted Eleanor since their wedding day finally escaped her lips. If not for a wager, if not from guilt over my father's death, why bind yourself to me? The Duke crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping just short of touching her. For the first time, she saw raw emotion in his face, frustration, determination, and something else she could not name. Because you were the only woman of my acquaintance who looked at me without fear or calculation, he said with quiet intensity. Because even when you believed me your enemy, you faced me with dignity and courage. Because in a world of Cecilias, you remained true to yourself, despite every hardship. Eleanor's breath caught at this unexpected declaration. You could have explained about my father's solicitor, about the fraud. Would you have believed me? He asked again, echoing their earlier conversation. Or would you have seen it as another manipulation by the man you were determined to hate? She had no answer for him. In the silence that stretched between them, the mantel clock ticked steadily, marking moments that seemed suspended in time. The wager was incidental, he finally continued, his voice low. I accepted your father's challenge to duel after he accused me of fraud. When he could not appear due to his state of mind, I went to Thornfield to demand an explanation. Instead I found you, fierce in your grief, protecting what remained of your family. It was then I knew I would have you as my Duchess or no one. Eleanor struggled to absorb this revelation, her mind reeling with implications. You desired me from our first meeting. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I admired you. Desire came later, when you continued to defy me at every turn. Heat rushed to Eleanor's cheeks at his candor. You have a curious way of pursuing a woman, Your Grace. Edward, he corrected gently. When we are alone, at least, I would hear my name from your lips. The intimacy of this request sent a tremor through her that had nothing to do with fear. Edward, she whispered, testing the shape of it in her mouth. He closed his eyes briefly, as if savoring the sound. When he opened them, the intensity of his gaze nearly stole her breath. I have never sought to buy your affection, Eleanor, but I did hope to earn your respect, given time. Time, she repeated softly. Outside, snow began to fall again, delicate flakes swirling against the darkening sky. Winter is not yet over. Perhaps, she hesitated, then continued with newfound courage. Perhaps there is still time for more than respect. Edward reached for her hand, raising it to his lips in a gesture that sent warmth spiraling through her. I would wait until 100 winters had passed, if that was what you required. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the blue salon, as husband and wife stood at the precipice of understanding, the first fragile bridge forming over the chasm that had separated them. A sudden gust rattled the window panes, drawing their attention to the worsening weather. The snow had thickened, obscuring the view of the gardens. A proper storm approaches, Edward observed, reluctantly releasing her hand. I must speak with the steward about the tenants in the North Fields. Eleanor nodded, knowing that duty must take precedence, yet strangely reluctant to end this moment of connection. Of course. As he reached the door, he paused, looking back at her with an expression that made her heart quicken. "Dine with me tonight, not in the formal dining room, but in my private study. There is more I would share with you." "I shall look forward to it," she replied, surprised to find she meant it sincerely. When he had gone, Eleanor remained by the window, watching the snow transform Ravenswood's grounds into a glistening white expanse. Something was changing between them, like the slow turning from winter toward spring, imperceptible day by day, yet inexorable in its progression. The door opened again, and Eleanor turned, half expecting, hoping, to see Edward returned. Instead, it was Sarah, her lady's maid, bearing a silver tray with a letter. "This just arrived for you, Your Grace," she said, curtsying. The messenger rode through the storm to deliver it personally. Eleanor took the missive, noting with surprise that it bore her father's seal, impossible unless someone else now possessed his signet ring. With trembling fingers, she broke the wax and unfolded the parchment. The handwriting was unfamiliar, spidery and hurried, but the words made her blood run cold. "The Duke deceives you still. If you would know the truth of your father's death and your husband's part in it, come alone to the North Gatehouse tomorrow at dusk. Tell no one, particularly not your husband, a well-wisher." The North Gatehouse stood silhouetted against the twilight sky, its stone archway dusted with snow that continued to fall in lazy, hypnotic spirals. Eleanor approached on foot, having dismissed her lady's maid after tea with the excuse of a headache and the desire to rest undisturbed until dinner. She had not planned to heed the mysterious summons. Indeed, she had nearly burned the letter after reading its ominous contents, yet doubt, that insidious companion, had crept back into her thoughts throughout the day. Edward had been forthcoming about the wager, yes, but only when directly confronted. What other secrets might he harbour? The evidence of her father's solicitor's fraud seemed persuasive, but she had not independently verified it, and there remained the question of why Edward had pursued her father's debts with such single-minded determination in the first place. These thoughts had plagued her until she found herself donning her warmest cloak and boots, slipping from the manor house via the conservatory doors while the servants were occupied with dinner preparations. Now, as she neared the gatehouse, trepidation filled her. The small stone building appeared deserted, its windows dark. Had she risked her husband's trust and her own safety for nothing but a cruel jest? "You came," a voice called softly from the shadows beside the arched entrance. "I wasn't certain you would." A figure emerged, a woman wrapped in a dark cloak, her features obscured by its hood. She beckoned Eleanor closer with a gloved hand. "Who are you?" Eleanor demanded, maintaining a cautious distance. "And why use my father's seal?" The woman pushed back her hood, revealing a face that was vaguely familiar, plain but intelligent, with keen eyes that assessed Eleanor critically. "My name is Miss Rebecca Carmichael," she said. "My brother was your father's solicitor, the man your husband claims defrauded the Blackwood estate." Eleanor's breath caught. "Claims? You dispute the evidence?" "I dispute the convenient narrative that absolves the Duke of all responsibility," Rebecca replied sharply. "My brother is not here to defend himself, having fled to avoid a worse fate." "What worse fate?" Eleanor asked, drawn despite herself into the shelter of the gatehouse as the wind picked up, driving the snow horizontally across the landscape. Rebecca struck a match, lighting a small oil lamp that cast eerie shadows across the stone walls. "Imprisonment. Or worse, the Duke of Ravenswood is not a man to cross, as your father discovered." Eleanor stiffened. "My father took his own life after his financial ruin." "Did he?" Rebecca's voice was soft with insinuation. "Or was that merely the official finding, arranged by a powerful duke who could benefit from such a conclusion?" "You suggest my husband had a hand in my father's death?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I suggest," Rebecca countered, "that your father discovered something about the Duke, something worth silencing him for. My brother helped your father compile evidence of the Duke's wrongdoings in certain business matters. Shortly thereafter, your father died, my brother fled, and all evidence vanished." She reached into her cloak and withdrew a small leather pouch. "Except for this," she continued, extracting a folded document. "My brother managed to preserve one piece of correspondence, a letter from your father to the magistrate, written the day before his death. He never had the chance to send it." Eleanor took the parchment with trembling hands. In the wavering lamplight, she recognized her father's handwriting, the familiar slant of his letters, bringing a pang of grief. The contents, however, chilled her to the bone. "I have uncovered evidence of grave misconduct in the Ravenswood coal mines," her father had written. "Workers' safety disregarded, deaths concealed, inspectors bribed. The Duke himself directed these practices for profit." I shall present full documentation tomorrow and request formal charges be brought. May God forgive me for not speaking sooner." The letter was signed and dated the day before Eleanor had found her father's body suspended from the library rafters. "This cannot be true," she whispered, though doubt had already taken root. "Can it not?" Rebecca challenged. "Consider, your father threatens to expose the Duke's crimes. The next day, he is dead. His daughter is left destitute, with only one option for survival: marriage to the very man who orchestrated her family's downfall. Quite convenient for silencing any further investigation, wouldn't you agree?" Eleanor's mind raced, trying to reconcile this damning account with the man who had returned her books, who had provided for her mother, who had looked at her with such intensity when she spoke his Christian name. "If what you say is true," she said carefully, "why reveal it to me now? What do you hope to gain?" Rebecca's expression hardened. "Justice for my brother, who was made a scapegoat. And perhaps salvation for you, Duchess. You have married a monster who will go to any lengths to protect his interests." "What would you have me do with this information?" Eleanor asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Take it to the magistrate," Rebecca urged. "With your father's letter and your testimony as the Duke's wife, an investigation must follow. My brother can return from exile to provide further evidence. And if I refuse, then you become complicit in the Duke's crimes," Rebecca said simply, "and I shall find another way to bring him to justice." A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the howl of the wind outside. Eleanor carefully refolded the letter, her thoughts in turmoil. "I must consider what you've told me," she finally said. "This is not a decision to be made in haste." Rebecca nodded reluctantly. "You have until the new moon, 3 days hence. After that I shall approach the London papers with what I know." "How can I contact you?" Eleanor asked. "Leave a note at the village post office, addressed to Miss Smith. I shall find it." Rebecca extinguished the lamp, plunging them back into twilight gloom. "Choose wisely, Duchess. Your future happiness depends upon it." With that warning, she slipped away into the swirling snow, leaving Eleanor alone with her father's damning letter and the weight of impossible choices. The return journey to Ravenswood Hall seemed interminable, each step laboured through deepening snow. By the time Eleanor reached the conservatory doors, her cloak was sodden and her boots caked with ice. She had barely enough time to hurry to her chambers and change before dinner with Edward in his study. Sarah helped her into a gown of deep burgundy velvet, exclaiming over her mistress's chilled hands and flushed cheeks. "Are you certain you're well enough for dinner, Your Grace?" the maid asked anxiously. "You look feverish." "It is merely the contrast between the cold and the fireside," Eleanor assured her, though in truth she felt light-headed with conflicting emotions. "Please inform His Grace that I shall join him shortly." When Sarah had gone, Eleanor withdrew her father's letter from her cloak pocket, staring at it as if it might speak further truths or lies. Finally, she locked it in her writing desk, tucking the small key into her bodice. Edward's private study occupied a corner of the manor's east wing, a masculine sanctuary of leather-bound books, rich mahogany furnishings, and the lingering scent of tobacco and brandy. He rose when she entered, his face illuminated by candlelight that softened his features. "You came," he said, echoing Rebecca Carmichael's earlier words with unwitting irony. "I feared the storm might have caused you to reconsider." "It would take more than snow to keep me from a promised conversation," Eleanor replied, hoping her voice betrayed none of her inner turmoil. He guided her to a small table set before the fire, more intimate than the formal dining room with its expanse of polished wood and array of footmen. Here a single servant had laid out a simple meal of roasted game, winter vegetables and freshly baked bread, a quiet luxury that would have seemed impossible during Eleanor's final months at Thornfield. "I dismissed the footman for the evening," Edward explained as he poured wine into crystal goblets. "I thought we might speak more freely without an audience." Eleanor's heart quickened at both his consideration and the reminder of Rebecca's accusations. "Would a man with nothing to hide seek such privacy?" "You said there was more you wished to share with me," she prompted when they were seated. Edward's expression grew solemn. "Yes, about your father and the circumstances that led to our marriage." Eleanor set down her fork, her appetite deserting her. "I'm listening." "Your father came to me initially seeking an investor for his textile mill expansion," Edward began. "During our discussions, I noticed discrepancies in the accounts he presented. My inquiries led me to other gentlemen who had experienced similar inconsistencies when working with the same solicitor, Carmichael." He paused, taking a sip of wine before continuing. "I began purchasing your father's debts, not to ruin him, but to protect him while I investigated Carmichael. I intended to present him with the evidence and restructure his obligations once the true culprit was identified. But you never had that opportunity," Eleanor supplied, watching his face carefully. A shadow crossed his features. "No, When I sent word that I had discovered the fraud, requesting an urgent meeting, your father responded with accusations that I was attempting to seize his business. He challenged me to a duel, which I accepted, hoping to explain in person. He never appeared for the duel, Eleanor whispered. No, Edward confirmed grimly. Instead, a note was delivered withdrawing the challenge. When I went to Thornfield the following day, I found— He hesitated, clearly reluctant to speak the words. You found that he had taken his own life, Eleanor finished for him. Or so it appeared. Edward's gaze sharpened at her choice of words. You have doubts about your father's death? Eleanor's fingers twisted in her napkin beneath the table. I wonder if there might have been other factors that contributed to his despair. Such as? The moment stretched between them, taut with unspoken suspicions. Eleanor thought of the letter concealed in her writing desk, of Rebecca Carmichael's accusations, of the coal miners allegedly sacrificed for profit, such as concerns about business practices he may have discovered, she said carefully. Perhaps regarding the Ravenswood coal mines? Edward went very still, his grey eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. When he spoke, his voice was dangerously soft. Who have you been speaking with, Eleanor? She lifted her chin. Does it matter? If the accusations are false, their source is irrelevant. It matters a great deal, he countered, rising from his chair to pace before the fire. Particularly if you've been approached by Rebecca Carmichael, a woman as adept at manipulation as her brother was at fraud. Eleanor's surprise must have shown on her face, for Edward gave a humorless laugh. Yes, I am aware of her presence in the county. My sources informed me she had returned from London last week. He turned to face Eleanor directly. What I don't know is what lies she has told you, or whether you believe them. She provided me with a letter, Eleanor admitted, seeing no point in further deception, purportedly written by my father the day before his death, detailing unsafe conditions in your mines and his intention to bring charges against you. Edward's expression darkened further. May I see this letter? I've secured it elsewhere, Eleanor replied, until I determine what to believe. He moved toward her then, his tall figure looming in the firelight. For a moment, Eleanor felt a flicker of fear. Was this the monster Rebecca had warned of, revealed at last? But when he reached her, Edward knelt beside Eleanor's chair, his face illuminated by the hearth's golden light. When he spoke, his voice was low and urgent. Eleanor, I implore you to trust me with this letter, not as your husband who commands, but as a man who asks for your faith. The raw vulnerability in his eyes stirred something deep within her, doubt, not of him now, but of Rebecca Carmichael's accusations. Why would she fabricate such a story? Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What could she hope to gain? Revenge, Edward replied simply, and perhaps something more valuable, misdirection. He rose and moved to his desk, withdrawing a key from his waistcoat pocket to unlock a drawer. From it, he retrieved a leather portfolio similar to the one containing her father's financial records. What I intended to share with you tonight, he said, returning to place it before her, was this. Eleanor opened the portfolio with trepidation. Inside lay documents bearing official seals, mining inspectors' reports, correspondence with engineers, payroll records, and hospital accounts. For the past 3 years, I have been implementing safety reforms in all Ravenswood mining operations, Edward explained as she scanned the papers. Improved ventilation, reinforced shafts, limited working hours, a physician on permanent retainer. The previous Duke, my father, considered such measures an unnecessary expense. Eleanor looked up sharply. These expenditures are substantial. Yes, he acknowledged. They have reduced our coal profits considerably, which is precisely why Carmichael targeted your father's business, to recoup losses from his own investments in the mines. I don't understand, Eleanor said, frowning. Samuel Carmichael was more than your father's solicitor, Edward explained, resuming his seat across from her. He was also my father's man of business for decades and a significant investor in Ravenswood Industries. When I began implementing safety measures after my father's death, Carmichael objected strenuously. When I refused to relent, he began seeking other means to maintain his income. By defrauding my father, Eleanor concluded. Among others, Edward confirmed. When I uncovered his scheme, he realized exposure was imminent. I believe he planted the forged letter you've been shown, anticipating that your father would discover the fraud and come to me. The letter would then cast suspicion on me, rather than him. Eleanor's mind raced, trying to align this explanation with what she knew of her father, of Edward, of the events that had led to their marriage. If what you say is true, she said slowly, then my father took his life believing you had orchestrated his ruin, when in fact you were trying to save him. Pain flashed across Edward's features. Yes, that knowledge has haunted me since the day I found him. It is why I felt such obligation to you and your mother, not from guilt over causing his death but from failing to prevent it. And the wager? She asked, needing to understand everything now. A foolish matter that arose after your father's death, he said dismissively. Lord Pembroke made his tasteless bet during a card game. I had already decided to offer for you, having seen your strength during those terrible days. The wager was merely incidental. Eleanor studied her husband's face, searching for any sign of deception. She found only earnest intensity and something else, a vulnerability that the formidable Duke rarely revealed to the world. The safety measures, she said, gesturing to the documents, these were implemented before my father's death, before you had any reason to fabricate such evidence? 3 years ago, Edward confirmed. You may speak with Dr. Matthews, who attends the miners, or with Mr. Harrison, the lead engineer. Both can verify the timeline of improvements. Eleanor rose from her chair, moving to the window where snow continued to fall, transforming Ravenswood into a crystalline wonderland. The grounds stretched before her, blanketed in white purity that belied the moral complexities within. Rebecca Carmichael gave me 3 days to decide whether to take the letter to the magistrate, she said without turning, after which she threatened to approach the London papers. She heard Edward's sharp intake of breath, then the sound of his chair as he pushed it back to stand. 3 days, he repeated, his tone hardening. The precise amount of time her brother would need to reach Dover and secure passage to the continent. Eleanor turned to face him. You believe this is about his escape? I believe Samuel Carmichael never left England, Edward said grimly. He's been hiding, perhaps within Ravenswood lands, waiting for an opportunity. His sister's appearance now with a convenient letter implicating me in your father's death suggests they are preparing to flee together, after ensuring I am too occupied with scandal to pursue them. He crossed to her, stopping just short of touching her. Eleanor, I have never lied to you. Not about the wager, not about your father, not about my intentions in marrying you. I ask only that you consider which explanation better fits the evidence before you and the man you have come to know these past weeks. The silence that stretched between them was filled with the weight of decision. Outside, the wind howled around Ravenswood's towers, a fitting accompaniment to Eleanor's turbulent thoughts. I will retrieve the letter, she finally said, but I would ask something of you in return. Name it, he replied without hesitation. Complete honesty between us from this moment forward, Eleanor said. No more secrets, no matter how painful or complex the truth may be. Edward's expression softened, relief evident in the subtle relaxation of his shoulders. You have my word. As Eleanor moved toward the door, intending to fetch the letter from her chambers, a sudden commotion in the corridor halted her steps. Raised voices, hurried footfalls, then an urgent knock. Enter, Edward called, his demeanor instantly transforming back to the authoritative Duke. Mr. Phillips, the steward, burst in, his face flushed with exertion and alarm. Your Grace, forgive the interruption. There's been an accident at the North Mine. A shaft collapse. Dr. Matthews has been summoned, but the snow is hampering rescue efforts. Edward was already reaching for his coat. How many men trapped? At least 7, possibly more, the steward replied grimly. And there's worse. Reports of fire in the lower galleries. Eleanor watched as her husband issued rapid orders. Horses to be readied, rescue teams assembled, the great hall to be prepared as a temporary infirmary. In that moment, she saw not the cold, calculating figure of Rebecca's accusations, but a man assuming the full weight of responsibility for those under his protection. I'm coming with you, she said firmly, when he turned to bid her good night. Surprise flashed across his face. The conditions will be dangerous, Eleanor. I am Duchess of Ravenswood, she replied, already reaching for her cloak. Those men and their families are my responsibility as much as yours. Something like pride kindled in Edward's eyes. He nodded once, sharply. Very well, but you will follow my instructions without question while we are at the mine. Together they hurried from the study, the mystery of Rebecca Carmichael and her brother's letter temporarily overshadowed by the urgent crisis before them. As they descended the grand staircase, Eleanor caught a glimpse of a figure slipping away down a servants' corridor, a woman in a dark cloak, moving with furtive purpose. Edward, she began, but the steward interrupted with another urgent matter requiring the Duke's attention. The moment passed, and soon they were mounting horses in the stable yard, prepared to ride through the storm to the aid of the trapped miners. Eleanor cast one last glance at the darkened windows of Ravenswood Hall, a shiver passing through her that had nothing to do with the biting wind. Someone had been watching, listening perhaps, and now they knew that she had chosen to stand with her husband rather than against him. The North Mine lay 3 miles from the main house, a journey made treacherous by deepening snow and the darkness of the winter night. By the time they arrived, a crowd had already gathered, miners from other shifts, wives, children, all illuminated by the eerie glow of lanterns against the snow. Dr. Matthews was directing the placement of stretchers in a hastily erected tent, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled by urgent work. When he spotted the Duke and Duchess, relief washed over his features. 7 men trapped in the northwest gallery, he reported without preamble. The main shaft is partially collapsed, and there's smoke coming from the ventilation shafts. Edward immediately joined the rescue coordinators, his commanding presence bringing order to the chaos. Eleanor moved among the families, offering what comfort she could, while inwardly marveling at the transformation in her husband. This was a man who knew each miner by name, who inquired after specific children, who demonstrated intimate knowledge of the mine's layout, not the actions of someone who disregarded workers' safety for profit, she thought. But then, what of her father's letter? What truth lay beneath these layers of contradiction? A woman's anguished cry drew Eleanor's attention. Our miner's wife had collapsed into the snow, overcome with fear for her husband trapped below. Without hesitation, Eleanor knelt beside her, snow soaking through her fine gown as she cradled the woman's rough hands in her own. The Duke himself leads the rescue, she assured the sobbing woman. He will not rest until all are saved. As dawn broke over Ravenswood, painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of rose and gold, the last of the trapped miners was brought to the surface, alive, though suffering from smoke inhalation. Edward emerged behind them, his face blackened with coal dust, his elegant evening clothes ruined beyond repair. His eyes sought Eleanor across the clearing, relief evident when he found her assisting Dr. Matthews with bandaging a miner's injured arm. She had worked through the night alongside the doctor, her hair falling from its pins, her gown stained with blood and dirt, yet to Edward's eyes, she had never appeared more beautiful. All accounted for, he announced to the waiting crowd. The fire is contained, though the Northwest Gallery will remain closed until proper repairs can be made. Full wages will continue during the closure. A cheer rose from the assembled miners and their families. Eleanor watched as they surrounded Edward, reaching to clasp his hand or touch his shoulder in gratitude. This was not the reception of workers toward a cruel master, but of people toward a leader who had proven his worth in crisis. As they rode back to Ravenswood Hall in the clear light of morning, Eleanor broke their companionable silence. You knew them all by name, every miner, every wife, every child. Edward nodded, fatigue evident in the slump of his shoulders. A duke may own the land, Eleanor, but it is the people who give it life. My father never understood that. And the safety measures in your documentation, they prevented this accident from becoming a tragedy, she observed. The reinforced main shaft held despite the collapse, he agreed. Without those improvements, we would be counting bodies rather than blessings this morning. Eleanor studied her husband's profile, the strong lines of his face softened by exhaustion, and the gentle morning light. In that moment, her decision crystallized with the clarity of the winter air around them. I believe you, she said simply, about Carmichael, about my father, about your intentions. When we return, I will give you the letter. Relief washed over Edward's features, though he made no move to touch her, respecting the delicate balance of trust newly established between them. Thank you, he said, the words carrying the weight of far more than her immediate promise. They rode the remainder of the journey in silence, each absorbed in private thoughts, yet somehow more connected than they had been since exchanging vows in the stone chapel of St. Agnes. As they approached Ravenswood Hall, however, a commotion at the main entrance dispelled their hard-won peace. Mrs. Winters stood on the steps, her normally composed features tight with concern. Beside her was a constable from the village, his expression grave. Your Grace, he called as they dismounted, I regret to inform you that there has been an incident. Lady Blackwood's cottage was broken into during the night. Eleanor's heart seized. My mother, is she harmed? Lady Blackwood is unharmed, Your Grace, Mrs. Winters assured her quickly, as is Mrs. Porter, but the intruder made quite a thorough search of the premises. Edward's expression darkened. What was taken? Nothing of value according to the ladies, the constable reported, but papers were disturbed in the late Mr. Blackwood's escritoire, which Lady Blackwood had brought from Thornfield. Eleanor and Edward exchanged a significant glance. Carmichael, he said quietly. I must go to my mother, Eleanor insisted, already turning toward the stables to request a fresh horse. Edward caught her arm gently. We will go together, after you have rested and changed. Your mother is safe, and the constable has posted men at the cottage. She hesitated, torn between urgency and the practical wisdom of his words. Finally, she nodded. 1 hour. Then we ride to Rose Cottage. As they entered the hall, another servant approached, bearing a silver tray with a letter addressed to the Duchess in an unfamiliar hand. Eleanor broke the seal, reading the contents with growing alarm. "Rebecca Carmichael requests an immediate meeting," she told Edward in a low voice. "She claims to have further evidence concerning my father's death, evidence that cannot wait." "A trap," Edward said flatly. "With your mother's cottage searched and the miner's accident diverting our attention, the Carmichaels are clearly executing some plan." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Yes, and I believe it's time we laid a trap of our own." Rose Cottage nestled at the southern edge of Ravenswood Estate, its modest dimensions belying the elegant comfort within. Smoke curled from the chimney into the clear afternoon sky, the morning snowfall already beginning to melt under tentative February sunshine. Eleanor found her mother in the small parlour, reclining on a chaise by the window. Lady Blackwood's face, so recently drawn with grief and illness, showed signs of returning vitality, a hint of colour in her cheeks, a brightness in her eyes that Eleanor had feared lost forever. "My darling girl," Lady Blackwood exclaimed, extending her hands in welcome. "What a fright we've had, though I must say the constable has been most attentive. I've never felt quite so important." Despite the gravity of circumstances, Eleanor smiled at her mother's irrepressible spirit. "Nothing was taken in the break-in?" "Nothing at all," Lady Blackwood confirmed, though every drawer and cabinet was thoroughly examined. "Most peculiar. Mrs. Porter is more distressed about the disorder than any threat to our persons." Edward, who had accompanied Eleanor after their brief rest at Ravenswood Hall, stood examining the escritoire in question. Its drawers hung open, papers disarranged but not removed. "Lady Blackwood," he said, turning from his inspection, "did your husband keep any particular documents here that might be of interest to others? Business papers, perhaps, or personal correspondence?" "Edward believes the intruder may have been Samuel Carmichael," Eleanor explained, seating herself beside her mother, "or someone working with him." Lady Blackwood's expression grew troubled. "Samuel. But I thought he had fled abroad after your father's—" She trailed off, the painful memory still too raw to articulate fully. "We have reason to believe he remained in England," Edward said gently, "and that he may be seeking to obscure his role in your husband's financial troubles." A flicker of understanding crossed Lady Blackwood's face. "There was a particular folio my husband kept locked in a compartment beneath the central drawer. He called it his insurance against uncertain times." Edward immediately knelt to examine the escritoire more closely. After a moment, his fingers discovered a nearly invisible seam in the wood. "The compartment has been forced open," he announced grimly, "recently, judging by the fresh scratches." "What did the folio contain, Mother?" Eleanor asked urgently. Lady Blackwood closed her eyes in concentration. "Letters, I believe. Correspondence with various business associates. Your father became quite secretive in those final months, though he did mention once that he was documenting certain improprieties he had discovered." Edward and Eleanor exchanged significant glances. "Did he mention whose improprieties, specifically?" Edward asked carefully. "Not directly," Lady Blackwood replied, "though I gathered it involved someone in a position of considerable influence." Her gaze sharpened suddenly. "You believe it was Carmichael himself, don't you? That my husband discovered his fraudulent activities?" "We do," Eleanor confirmed, taking her mother's hand. "And we believe the document Rebecca Carmichael showed me, purportedly written by father and accusing Edward of misconduct, was actually a forgery created to divert suspicion." Lady Blackwood's brow furrowed. "Rebecca, that mousy creature who sometimes accompanied her brother to Thornfield. What role does she play in this affair?" "She approached me claiming to have evidence of Edward's wrongdoing," Eleanor explained. "Evidence that implicated him in father's death." "Preposterous," Lady Blackwood exclaimed with unexpected vehemence. "Your father spoke of the Duke with respect, even when they disagreed on business matters. He called him the only honest peer in London on more than one occasion." This revelation stunned Eleanor into momentary silence. Her father had respected Edward, even as his financial situation deteriorated. How could this align with the challenge to duel, with the desperate final act that had orphaned her? Edward seemed equally surprised, though he recovered quickly. "Your husband's good opinion was not something I was aware of, Lady Blackwood. Had I known, perhaps events might have unfolded differently." "George was a proud man," Lady Blackwood said softly. "Too proud at times to accept help or admit error. When he realized the extent of the financial disaster, that pride prevented him from approaching you directly." A silence fell over the parlour, heavy with the weight of what might have been. Outside, a robin alighted on the snow-covered hedgerow, its red breast a vivid spot of colour against the white landscape, like blood on a pristine page, Eleanor thought with a shiver. "The letter," she said suddenly, turning to Edward. "I left it locked in my writing desk at Ravenswood." "Which may no longer be secure," he concluded, rising. "We should return immediately." They bid a hasty farewell to Lady Blackwood, promising to send additional men to guard the cottage. As they rode back toward Ravenswood Hall, Eleanor shared her developing plan. "We must respond to Rebecca's request for a meeting," she said, "but on our terms. If she believes I am still uncertain of your guilt, she may reveal more than she intends." Edward considered this. "A dangerous game, Eleanor. The Carmichaels have already demonstrated their desperation, which makes them unpredictable but also vulnerable," she countered. "If we can secure the forged letter as evidence and perhaps lure Samuel into the open, we would need the magistrate's cooperation," Edward mused, "and absolute discretion among the household staff." Eleanor nodded, her determination growing with each moment. "I will respond to Rebecca agreeing to meet tomorrow at noon. Not at the isolated location she suggested, but at the parish church. Holy ground may discourage any violence, and Vicar Matthews can serve as a witness if needed. While you meet with Rebecca, I can have men watching all roads leading from Ravenswood lands," Edward added. "If Samuel attempts to flee during the distraction, we will apprehend him." They had reached the main gates of Ravenswood when a rider approached from the opposite direction. Mr. Winters, the Duke's solicitor, his horse lathered from hard riding. "Your Grace," he called, reining in beside them. "Urgent news from London. Lord Harrington has filed a petition challenging your marriage on grounds of coercion. Lady Harrington is named as an interested party." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "Cecilia," she whispered. "This is Carmichael's work," Edward said grimly, using his connection to the Harringtons to attack from an unexpected quarter. "The petition cites evidence that the Duchess was forced into marriage under threat of destitution," Mr. Winters continued, "and that such coercion renders the union invalid in the eyes of both law and church." "Ridiculous," Eleanor snapped, surprising both men with her vehemence. "I entered the marriage willingly, with full understanding of its terms. Nevertheless," Mr. Winters cautioned, "such accusations, particularly from a family of Harrington's standing, will cause considerable scandal. The case is set to be heard in 3 weeks' time, precisely when we would be expected to make our London debut for the season," Edward observed. "The timing is not coincidental." Eleanor's mind raced ahead, seeing the pattern emerging. The Carmichaels needed leverage against you, something that would prevent you from pursuing Samuel for his crimes. "What better than a public scandal questioning the legitimacy of your marriage? With Cecilia waiting in the wings as the proper choice for Duchess," Edward concluded, his expression hardening. "A scheme elegant in its viciousness." They proceeded through the gates toward Ravenswood Hall, the three of them now discussing strategy in urgent tones. Upon reaching the house, however, they found further disruption awaiting them. Mrs. Winters met them in the entrance hall, her usual composure noticeably frayed. "Your Graces forgive me, but there has been an incident during your absence." Her Grace's chambers were entered, and her writing desk was forced open. Eleanor exchanged an alarmed glance with Edward. "The letter? Gone," Mrs. Winters confirmed, and one of the maids reports seeing a woman matching Miss Carmichael's description leaving through the servants' entrance shortly thereafter. The pieces of the conspiracy were falling into place with alarming rapidity. Rebecca now possessed both the forged letter and, presumably, whatever genuine documents Samuel had stolen from Lady Blackwood's cottage. With these, the Carmichaels could create a compelling case against Edward, while destroying evidence of Samuel's own crimes. "We must act quickly," Edward said, already striding toward his study. "Mr. Winters, draft a formal response to Lord Harrington's petition, categorical denial of all charges, with Lady Blackwood cited as witness to the voluntary nature of the marriage." "And Rebecca?" Eleanor asked, following him. "She still expects me to meet her tomorrow." Edward paused, turning to face her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "That meeting shall proceed as planned, but you will not attend alone." As evening descended upon Ravenswood, Eleanor sat in the blue salon composing her response to Rebecca Carmichael. The note was deliberately ambiguous, suggesting uncertainty about Edward's guilt while agreeing to the meeting at St. Agnes Church, rather than the isolated location Rebecca had proposed. "This should convince her that I remain torn between loyalty to my husband and justice for my father," she told Edward, who stood by the hearth watching her seal the letter with her own crest. "And when she arrives expecting to find you alone and vulnerable, she will instead face both of us, the magistrate, and the evidence of her brother's crimes," he said with grim satisfaction. Eleanor nodded, though a shadow of doubt crossed her features. "Do you think they will come? Now that they have the forged letter, they might simply flee." "They need more than just the letter," Edward reasoned. "They need your testimony to give it credibility. Without that, it becomes merely the accusation of a fugitive's sister." A footman was summoned to deliver the note to the village post office, addressed to Miss Smith as Rebecca had instructed. When he had gone, Eleanor moved to stand beside Edward at the hearth, the warmth of the fire a stark contrast to the chill of anxiety that had settled within her. "Tomorrow could end this conspiracy," she said softly, "or it could begin a scandal that would haunt Ravenswood for generations." Edward's hand found hers, his touch conveying strength and reassurance. "Whatever comes, Eleanor, we face it together, not as a duke and his convenient bride, but as husband and wife in truth." The simple declaration warmed her more deeply than the fire's glow. She turned to face him fully, searching his storm-grey eyes for the man beneath the title, the boy in the portrait gallery, the duke who remembered minors' names, the husband who had granted her space to form her own judgments. "In truth," she echoed, the words carrying a weight beyond their simplicity. His gaze dropped to her lips, a question in his eyes that needed no voice. Eleanor answered by closing the distance between them, her hands resting lightly on his chest as she lifted her face to his. Their first kiss was tentative, a gentle exploration of unfamiliar territory. Then Edward's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as the kiss deepened into something more profound, an affirmation, a promise, a new beginning. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Eleanor smiled up at him with newfound certainty. "I believe we have a conspiracy to unravel tomorrow, Your Grace." A rare smile transformed Edward's usually solemn features. "Indeed we do, Your Grace." That night, Eleanor slept soundly for the first time since her arrival at Ravenswood Hall. When dawn broke crisp and clear, she rose with determination to face whatever the day might bring. Edward had arranged every detail with military precision. The magistrate, Sir William Cavendish, would be positioned in the vicar's office adjacent to the church nave. Constables would be stationed discreetly around the churchyard, while the Duke's most trusted men watched the roads leading from Ravenswood lands. Eleanor dressed with care in a gown of deep green velvet, her hair arranged in a simple but elegant style that suggested composure and confidence. The Duchess of Ravenswood would meet Rebecca Carmichael not as a frightened girl easily manipulated, but as a woman prepared to defend her husband and uncover the truth. "Are you certain you wish to face her directly?" Edward asked, as they rode side by side toward St. Agnes Church, the winter sun casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. "Absolutely," Eleanor replied. "Rebecca must see that her scheme has failed, that she has not driven a wedge between us as intended." Edward studied her profile, admiration evident in his gaze. "You would have made a formidable opponent in the House of Lords had you been born male." She laughed, the sound bright in the winter air. "Perhaps we can consider it fortunate for Parliament that I was not." St. Agnes Church stood silent and watchful as they approached, its ancient stone walls bearing witness to centuries of human drama. No other horses were tethered in the churchyard, suggesting they had arrived before Rebecca. Inside, the nave was empty, save for the vicar, who greeted them with appropriate deference before withdrawing to his office where the magistrate waited. Eleanor took her position in the front pew, while Edward concealed himself in the vestry, close enough to intervene if necessary. The appointed hour of noon approached, marked by the distant tolling of the church bell. Eleanor sat motionless, her posture betraying none of the tension coiled within her. The minutes stretched, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of ancient timbers settling. noon came and went, no sign of Rebecca Carmichael. At 1 o'clock, Edward emerged from the vestry, his expression grave. "She's not coming." "No," Eleanor agreed, rising from the pew. "I suspect Rebecca and her brother are already miles from Ravenswood." They conferred briefly with Sir William, who agreed to issue warrants for the Carmichaels' arrest. As they exited the church, however, one of Edward's men rode into the churchyard at a gallop. "Your Grace," he called, dismounting hastily. Smoke has been sighted rising from the north woods, near the old hunting lodge, a substantial fire by all accounts. Edward's face darkened with sudden understanding. "The diversion we anticipated has simply taken another form. They never intended to meet us here." Eleanor gripped his arm. "The hunting lodge, could that be where Samuel has been hiding?" "Possibly," Edward acknowledged. "And now they're destroying evidence before their escape." Decisions were made rapidly. Men dispatched to fight the fire, others to secure the roads. A messenger sent to alert the nearest magistrates in surrounding counties. Edward and Eleanor mounted their horses, intending to return to Ravenswood Hall to coordinate efforts from there. As they crested the hill overlooking the estate, however, a second plume of smoke became visible, this one rising from the direction of Rose Cottage. "Mother," Eleanor gasped, her heart seizing with terror. Without hesitation, Edward wheeled his horse toward the southern boundary. "Ride for Ravenswood," he commanded the nearest man. "Send the doctor and more men to Rose Cottage immediately." They galloped across the snow-covered fields, taking the most direct route rather than following the winding lane. Eleanor's fear grew with every hoofbeat, terrible images flashing through her mind. Her mother trapped, flames consuming the cottage, the Carmichaels' final act of vengeance. Rose Cottage came into view at last, but to Eleanor's immense relief no flames were visible. The smoke rose instead from a small outbuilding at the property's edge, while the cottage itself stood intact. As they drew closer, an unexpected tableau emerged, Mrs. Porter wielding a garden rake with surprising ferocity, while Lady Blackwood stood on the cottage steps, a pistol held steadily in her hand. Between them, collapsed in the snow with blood staining his shirt sleeve, was a man Eleanor had seen only in glimpses before, Samuel Carmichael. "Mother!" Eleanor cried, dismounting before her horse had fully stopped. "Are you harmed?" Lady Blackwood lowered the pistol slightly, her composure remarkable under the circumstances. "Not in the slightest, my dear. Though I fear I've ruined your father's favourite pistol by actually using it. The recoil is quite shocking." Edward approached more cautiously, eyeing the wounded man. "Mr. Carmichael, I presume. You've led us on quite a chase." Samuel Carmichael glared up at him, clutching his injured arm. "This proves nothing, Ravenswood. My sister has already departed for London with evidence of your crimes. By week's end your name will be ruined beyond repair." "I think not," came a new voice from behind them. All turned to see Sir William Cavendish dismounting from his horse, accompanied by 2 constables. In his hand, he held a familiar leather folio. "Found this on Miss Carmichael when we apprehended her attempting to board the mail coach," Sir William explained. "Most interesting reading, particularly the letters bearing your signature, Mr. Carmichael, authorizing transactions in Mr. Blackwood's name without his knowledge." Samuel's face drained of color. "Those were business arrangements. Blackwood authorized everything, including the purchase of mining shares using funds embezzled from his textile mill?" Edward asked coldly. "I think not." Lady Blackwood stepped forward, the pistol now pointed directly at Carmichael's heart. "My husband discovered your theft weeks before his death. He documented everything." "Then why kill himself?" Samuel demanded. "If he had evidence, why not bring charges?" A shadow crossed Lady Blackwood's face. "Because you threatened our daughter, Mr. Carmichael. You sent that anonymous note claiming Eleanor would suffer a tragic accident should George expose your crimes." Eleanor gasped, the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. Her father's suicide had been an act of desperate protection, sacrificing himself to ensure her safety, believing that his death would end Carmichael's motive for harming her. "He left no evidence of this threat," Samuel insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "He told me," Lady Blackwood replied softly, "the night before he took his life. His final words to me were, 'Keep her safe until Ravenswood can protect her.' He knew, you see. Knew the Duke was investigating your crimes independently. Knew Edward was perhaps the only man powerful enough to stand against you and your connections." The magistrate signalled to the constables, who moved forward to take Samuel into custody. "You'll hang for this, Carmichael. Fraud, extortion, arson, and attempted murder. The evidence is overwhelming." As Samuel was led away, still protesting his innocence, Eleanor turned to her mother with newfound understanding. "You knew. All this time, you knew father intended me to marry Edward." Lady Blackwood smiled sadly. "I suspected, though he never stated it directly. Your father admired the Duke's integrity. When all seemed lost, I believe he hoped Ravenswood might offer you protection, though he could never have foreseen the particular path that led you to the altar." Eleanor's gaze sought Edward, who stood a few paces away, allowing this moment between mother and daughter. Their eyes met across the snow-dusted garden, and in that glance passed a wordless communication, grief for what had been lost, gratitude for what had been found, hope for what might yet be built from the ashes of conspiracy and misunderstanding. The February sun broke through clouds overhead, casting a golden light across Ravenswood's winter-bound lands. In that moment of clarity, Eleanor understood that the hatred she had carried like a shield had transformed into something else entirely, something she had never expected to find in this arranged marriage to a man she had once believed her enemy. "Mother," she said quietly, "I believe it's time we returned home, to Ravenswood." March arrived at Ravenswood with tentative warmth, the first crocuses pushing through snow-patched ground beneath the library windows. Eleanor stood watching their purple and yellow heads nodding in the breeze, a letter from London held loosely in her hands. The past month had brought sweeping changes, both to the estate and to her understanding of the man she had married. Samuel Carmichael now awaited trial in Newgate Prison, his sister having turned King's evidence against him in exchange for leniency. Lord Harrington had withdrawn his petition challenging the marriage, faced with affidavits from Lady Blackwood and the vicar attesting to Eleanor's willing participation in the ceremony. Most significant, perhaps, was the transformation within Ravenswood Hall itself. Where once cold formality had reigned, a new warmth permeated its ancient stones. Edward had moved Eleanor's chambers to adjoin his own, connecting them with a private sitting room, where they now spent their evenings in quiet companionship, reading aloud from her recovered books or discussing improvements to the estate. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, her embroidery frame before her, his estate ledgers open on the desk, domestic tranquility neither had expected to find in their arranged marriage. Eleanor turned from the window as the library door opened to admit Edward, his tall figure now a welcome sight, rather than a source of apprehension. "The London letter?" he inquired, noting the paper in her hands. She nodded. "Cecilia Harrington has announced her betrothal to Lord Pembroke. They are to be married in June." A wry smile touched Edward's lips. "Pembroke will find himself well matched. I almost pity him." "Almost," Eleanor agreed, returning his smile. She set the letter aside, moving toward the tea tray that Mrs. Winters had arranged by the fire. "Will you join me?" The simple domestic ritual had become precious to them both, this quiet hour between the day's duties and the evening meal, when they were neither Duke and Duchess nor survivors of conspiracy, but simply Edward and Eleanor. "The Miners' Relief Fund is fully established," he told her, as she passed him a cup prepared exactly as he preferred. "The Board of Trustees meets next week to review the first applications." The fund had been Eleanor's suggestion, a portion of coal profits dedicated to supporting miners' families in times of injury or hardship. Edward had expanded the concept, adding provisions for education and medical care. "You've transformed Ravenswood," she said softly. "Your father would scarcely recognize the estate you've built." "Nor would I wish him to," Edward replied, his tone hardening momentarily before softening again as he gazed at her. "But it is not I alone who has wrought these changes. The miners' wives speak of nothing but their audience with the Duchess during the accident. You've won their loyalty more thoroughly in one night than I managed in years." Eleanor felt warmth rise to her cheeks at his praise. "I merely did what any decent person would." "Perhaps," he acknowledged. "But decency is rarer than you might imagine, particularly among those born to privilege." They lapsed into comfortable silence, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the library floor. Eleanor found herself studying her husband's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows that appeared when he was deep in thought, the eyes that had once seemed cold as winter, now warm with affection when they turned her way. "I received another letter today," she said after a moment, "from Mrs. Winters." Edward looked up in surprise. "Our housekeeper writes to you while residing under the same roof." Eleanor smiled. "It is her formal resignation as housekeeper and her acceptance of my offer to become companion to my mother at Rose Cottage. She believes the position better suits her advancing years." "A sensible arrangement," Edward agreed, "though we shall miss her efficiency." "I've already selected her replacement," Eleanor continued. "Sarah has shown remarkable organizational skills beyond her duties as my lady's maid." Edward's eyebrows rose. "A bold choice. The staff may resist taking direction from one so young." "They will adapt," Eleanor said with newfound confidence, "as we all have these past months." The light shifted as clouds passed overhead, momentarily dimming the library before brightness returned. Eleanor moved to stand beside Edward's chair, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "Spring approaches," she said, looking toward the window where crocuses nodded in the March breeze. "The London season will begin soon." "Indeed," Edward replied, covering her hand with his own, "though I find myself surprisingly reluctant to leave Ravenswood this year." Eleanor understood his meaning immediately. At Ravenswood, they had found an unexpected peace, a growing connection that flourished in private. London would mean society's scrutiny, speculation about their hasty marriage, endless navigation of complex social waters. "We must go," she said gently, "if only to silence gossip with our presence. A duke and duchess who hide in the country only fuel rumors." Edward sighed, acknowledging the truth of her words. "Then we shall face London together, as we faced the Carmichaels." "As husband and wife," Eleanor agreed, her voice softening on the words that had once seemed a prison sentence, but now held different meaning entirely. He rose from his chair, turning to face her with an intensity that still had the power to quicken her pulse. "Eleanor," he began, then hesitated, as if weighing his words with unusual care. "These past months, since the conspiracy was unraveled, I have not pressed my rights as a husband." A flush spread across her cheeks at his meaning. Their marriage remained unconsummated, Edward having granted her time to adjust to their new understanding without the pressure of physical intimacy. "You have been most considerate," she acknowledged, her gaze steady despite her heightened color. "It was not merely consideration," he admitted. "I wanted Needed, to be certain that you came to me willingly, not from obligation or gratitude, but from—" He paused, the word clearly difficult for a man unaccustomed to expressing tender emotions. "Love?" she supplied softly. The vulnerable hope that flashed across his features made him appear younger, more like the boy in the portrait gallery than the forbidding duke who had purchased her father's debts. "I would not presume to ask for what might not yet exist," he said carefully. Eleanor took a step closer, her hand rising to rest against his cheek. "Then do not ask," she whispered. "Simply accept what is freely offered." The kiss that followed contained all the words neither yet had courage to speak aloud: promise and passion, tenderness and trust, hard won through winter's trials. Outside, the March winds scattered the last of February's snow from Ravenswood's ancient oaks, making way for spring's inevitable renewal. April blossomed across Ravenswood in a riot of daffodils and early tulips, their bright heads bobbing in gentle breezes that carried the scent of renewal. The preparations for London dominated the household. Trunks packed with the new wardrobe Edward had commissioned for his Duchess, correspondence exchanged with their townhouse staff, arrangements made for Lady Blackwood and Mrs. Winters to follow a fortnight later. On the eve of their departure, Eleanor walked the formal gardens with her husband, her hand resting in the crook of his arm with the easy familiarity that had grown between them. "The London papers continue to speculate about our marriage," she remarked, referencing the latest society columns Mrs. Winters had dutifully included with the morning's correspondence. "They seem particularly fixated on whether the Duke of Ravenswood has been tamed by his mysterious country bride." Edward snorted, a most undignified sound that would have shocked the very columnists who wrote of him as the embodiment of aristocratic hauteur. "Let them speculate. Reality would disappoint their romantic notions." "Would it?" Eleanor asked with an arch smile. "The fearsome duke who once made debutantes tremble now reads poetry aloud in the evenings and consults his wife on estate matters. Some might consider that quite a transformation." His fingers tightened over hers, his expression softening in the way it did only when they were alone. "The transformation was not in me, Eleanor, but in how I am seen." "You looked past the title and fortune to find the man beneath. A man worth finding," she said softly. They paused beside a marble bench overlooking the lake, now freed from winter's icy grip. A pair of swans glided across its surface, their reflections perfect in the still water. "I have something for you," Edward said, reaching into his coat pocket. "A token for your first season as Duchess of Ravenswood." He withdrew a small velvet box and placed it in her palm. Eleanor opened it to find a necklace of pearls surrounding a single flawless sapphire that matched her eyes. "It belonged to my grandmother," he explained, as she traced the setting with gentle fingers. "The only woman in recent Ravenswood history who married for love rather than advantage." "It's beautiful," she whispered, touched by both the gift and its significance. "My grandfather was a second son who unexpectedly inherited the title," Edward continued, taking the necklace from its box and moving behind her to fasten it around her throat. "He had already married for affection, scandalizing society, yet theirs was the only truly happy union in the family chronicles." The sapphire rested cool against Eleanor's skin, its weight both substantial and somehow comforting. She turned to face her husband, emotion tightening her throat. "Thank you." His eyes darkened as they lingered on the jewel, then rose to meet her gaze. "I have never been a man of many words, Eleanor. Sentiment does not come easily after years of guarding against it. But I would have you know, before we faced London together, that what began as a marriage of convenience has become—" He paused, searching for the right expression. "Essential," she supplied, understanding his struggle to articulate feelings so long suppressed. Relief softened his features. "Precisely so. You have become essential to me, to my happiness, to my purpose, to the person I wish to be rather than the duke I was raised to become." Eleanor reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "As you have become to me." Who would have imagined that snowy day in the market square that hatred could transform so completely? "Into what?" he asked, his voice lowered to a near whisper. "Into love," she answered simply. The word no longer frightening but a statement of truth they had both recognized, yet not named until this moment. The kiss they shared beneath April's tender sky held none of the hesitation of their earlier embraces. This was certainty, possession, promise fulfilled. When they finally parted, Edward rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. "London awaits us tomorrow," he said, regaining his composure with visible effort. "Tonight, however, tonight belongs only to us," Eleanor finished for him, her meaning clear in the blush that rose to her cheeks, even as her gaze remained steady. They returned to the house hand in hand, ignoring the knowing smiles exchanged by the servants who had witnessed their master's gradual thaw from frigid formality to warmth in his bride's presence. Dinner that evening was a private affair in Edward's study, now their study, served by a single footman who was dismissed immediately after the final course. Later, when darkness had fallen across Ravenswood and only the moon illuminated the grand chambers of the east wing, Eleanor stood before the connecting door to her husband's rooms, dressed in a nightgown of fine silk, another of Edward's gifts, though one she had not yet had courage to wear. She raised her hand to knock, then paused, remembering his words from months before. "Nothing is forbidden to you here." With newfound confidence, she opened the door without announcement. Edward stood by the hearth, still partially dressed in shirt sleeves and waistcoat, a glass of brandy untouched in his hand. He turned at her entrance, his expression transforming from surprise to something far more elemental as he took in her appearance. "I thought perhaps," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she had expected, "that the Duchess of Ravenswood might properly share her husband's chambers on the eve of their London debut." The glass was set aside, forgotten. "The Duchess of Ravenswood," Edward replied, crossing the room to stand before her, "may do precisely as she wishes, now and always." Words gave way to touch as winter's last restraints melted in spring's inevitable warmth. In the grand bed where generations of Blackthorn dukes had slept in solitary state, Edward and Eleanor discovered the final transformation of their unlikely union, from arrangement to affection, from duty to desire, from convenience to consuming passion that left them both breathless with wonder. As midnight approached, Eleanor lay with her head pillowed on her husband's chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, its rhythm a counterpoint to their synchronized breathing. "I never expected this," she confessed into the darkness. "When I agreed to marry you, I thought I was sacrificing all chance of happiness for my mother's security." Edward's arms tightened around her, "and I believed I was merely fulfilling an obligation. To your father, to my conscience, to the estate that required a duchess." His fingers traced idle patterns along her bare shoulder. "How limited my understanding was then." Eleanor smiled against his skin. "We begin our London season tomorrow not as the world expects, a convenient match between power and desperation, but as something far more subversive." "Subversive?" Edward questioned, amusement coloring his tone. "Indeed," she confirmed, rising on one elbow to look down at him in the firelight. "A duke and duchess who have committed the most unfashionable of sins." "And what sin is that, madam wife?" Her smile turned tender as she bent to brush her lips against his. "We have fallen quite thoroughly in love." His answering kiss contained promise, possession, and something that might have been joy, an emotion long absent from Ravenswood Hall, but now taking root in its ancient stones, as persistent and hopeful as the spring flowers pushing through the last traces of winter's snow. Morning would bring London, with its scrutiny and social complexities. For tonight, however, the Duke and Duchess of Ravenswood acknowledged only each other, and the unexpected love that had bloomed in the most unlikely of seasons. The late September sunshine bathed Ravenswood's south lawn in golden light as servants arranged chairs in neat rows before a flower-bedecked pavilion. 6 months had passed since the Duke and Duchess had taken London society by storm, their evident devotion to one another confounding gossips who had predicted a cold, convenient alliance. Eleanor supervised the final preparations from the terrace, her figure noticeably changed by the child she carried, a secret joy shared only with Edward and her mother, until her condition became impossible to disguise. Now, with the heir to Ravenswood safely past the precarious early months, they had decided to celebrate with an unprecedented gesture, opening the estate for a harvest festival to which all tenants and villagers were invited. "Your mother is inspecting the refreshment tables for the 3rd time," Edward remarked, joining her on the terrace. Mrs. Winters appears torn between admiration for her thoroughness and offence that her arrangements might be found wanting. Eleanor laughed, leaning into his embrace as his hand came to rest protectively over the gentle swell of her abdomen. "They have formed a formidable alliance, those two. Rose Cottage has never been so efficiently managed." "Much like Ravenswood under your guidance," Edward observed, pride evident in his voice. Indeed, the estate had flourished in the months since their return from London. Eleanor had instituted a school for tenants' children, staffed by qualified teachers rather than the overworked vicar's wife who had previously struggled alone. The Miners' Relief Fund had expanded to include medical services and improved housing. Even Ravenswood Hall itself had shed its forbidding atmosphere, with unused rooms opened, fresh flowers in every chamber, and regular musical evenings that drew neighbours from across the county. "The mine manager's report arrived this morning," Edward continued. Production has increased by 15% since the new safety measures were fully implemented, proving that treating workers with dignity benefits all, Eleanor noted with satisfaction. They watched in comfortable silence as the first guests began to arrive, farmers in their Sunday best, miners with scrubbed faces and neatly combed hair, shopkeepers from the village escorting wives in carefully preserved finery. "Your father would be proud," Edward said softly, "of all you've accomplished here." Eleanor felt the familiar pang that accompanied her father's memory, though time had gentled its sharpness. "I believe he would, though he might be rather astonished to find his daughter so contentedly established as mistress of Ravenswood. No more astonished than the Duke of Ravenswood finds himself as a contented husband," Edward replied, with the dry humour that had emerged as their intimacy deepened. Their quiet moment was interrupted by Lady Blackwood, ascending the terrace steps with remarkable vigour for a woman who had been near death just months earlier. The country air and freedom from financial worry had worked wonders for her health. "Eleanor, darling, you really must come see the display of preserves the tenants' wives have brought. Most impressive, though I've suggested a more advantageous arrangement by size rather than type. Mrs. Porter is implementing my recommendations as we speak." Edward suppressed a smile as Eleanor dutifully allowed herself to be led away, throwing him a mock helpless glance over her shoulder. His Duchess had transformed not only Ravenswood, but also his understanding of what marriage could be, a partnership of minds and hearts, rather than the cold, formal arrangement he had witnessed in his parents. By mid-afternoon, the festival was in full swing. Children raced across the lawns, village musicians played for dancing on a wooden platform erected for the occasion, and long tables groaned beneath platters of harvest bounty. Edward moved among the guests with an ease that would have astonished London society, addressing each person by name, inquiring after specific concerns with genuine interest. Eleanor watched him from beneath the pavilion, where she had been persuaded to rest, one hand resting on her growing child. This man, once feared as the coldest, most forbidding peer in England, now knelt to admire a little girl's doll, his smile transforming his features into something approaching boyish charm. As twilight approached, lanterns were lit along the pathways, casting a magical glow across the gathering. Edward returned to Eleanor's side as the village vicar rose to offer a blessing for the harvest and the estate that provided livelihoods for so many. "I have something for you," Edward murmured, pressing a small package into her hand as the vicar's words washed over the assembled company. Eleanor unwrapped it curiously to find a miniature portrait, a beautiful rendering of the two of them, her seated and Edward standing beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder in a gesture both protective and proud. "For our child," he explained softly, "that he or she might always know the truth of us, not the Duke and Duchess of Ravenswood, but Edward and Eleanor, who found their way to each other through winter's trials." Tears pricked at Eleanor's eyes as she traced the delicate brushwork with one finger. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Thank you." As darkness fell and the festival concluded with a display of fireworks over the lake, Edward and Eleanor stood together on the terrace, watching coloured lights reflect in the still waters. Guests departed with baskets of provisions and heartfelt thanks, children sleeping on father's shoulders, mothers gathering up prizes won in the day's games. "Was it worth it?" Eleanor asked suddenly, turning to her husband. "Marrying the daughter of a ruined gentleman? Enduring scandal and conspiracy? Transforming Ravenswood from what your father built into something entirely new?" Edward considered her question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "If you're asking whether I would choose the same path knowing what lay ahead," he replied, drawing her closer, "the answer is yes, though perhaps with fewer misunderstandings and a more expedient resolution to the matter of the Carmichaels." She laughed softly, resting her head against his shoulder as the final rockets burst overhead, showering the night sky with ephemeral stars. "Winter ends," Edward murmured into her hair. "Spring arrives. The cycle continues." His hand moved to cradle the swell of their child. But some things, once transformed, remain changed forever. Eleanor closed her eyes, savouring the moment. The warmth of her husband's embrace, the gentle movement of their child within her, the knowledge that Ravenswood had become not a prison of hatred but a sanctuary of love. "Forever," she agreed softly, "beyond winter's end." In the crucible of adversity, hatred can transform into its opposite, not by force or decree but through the patient revelation of truth and character. Where prejudice clouds judgment, only time and honest observation can clear the path to understanding. The greatest barriers between hearts are often built of misunderstanding rather than malice, and the most enduring love may grow from the most unlikely beginnings if we have the courage to look beyond our first impressions and the wisdom to recognize when circumstances have revealed a person's true nature rather than the face they present to the world. Did you enjoy this story? If so, please subscribe to our channel for more historical romance stories that warm the heart and transport you to another era. Leave a comment below sharing your favorite moment from Eleanor and Edward's journey from hatred to love. Your feedback helps us create more stories that capture your imagination and touch your soul.